All right. Good morning, everyone. Afternoon, wherever you are. Hello and welcome to today's discussion and episode of Drop the Mic Monday. My name is Shiloh Emmeline. I'm the member coordinator here at About Face, Veterans Against the War. I'm a queer and trans veteran living on Muwekma Ohlone land, aka San Lorenzo, California. I couldn't possibly be more excited for our discussion today on queer and trans struggles and the struggle to free our communities from militarism with two people who I admire greatly and adore. I'm very excited. Before we begin, I learned this practice of holding ancestral space from a dear love and facilitator that I wanted to share with you all before we begin. And it feels especially salient given the discussion we're about to have on queer liberation and anti-militarism. It's the practice of holding space for our ancestors who scratched and clawed and threw bricks and lit fires in the active hope that we could be right here, right now. So I'll pause for a moment and invite anyone watching to speak the names or type them in the chat of whichever platform you're on. And if Britton or Mason, you want to speak the names of some ancestors you'd like to bring into the space today, you're welcome to do that. And Yeah, so we'll just take a moment for that.
Yeah, I was thinking about this ancestral remembrance, and something had come up for me recently. A friend of mine I'm involved in also the psychiatric survivor community, community of people who have experienced harm within current psychiatric systems. Um, and they were doing a project on the local Milwaukee County behavioral health complex. And there is actually cemetery grounds there, um, uh, that are very old. There's been archaeological digs, and they came across a marker actually. And I just wanted to read that and bring in to this remembrance some people. This is how the current marker at this area reads. And I want to offer a content warning here as well, in terms of uh, stigmatizing portrayals of people with lived experience of mental health or substance use. Um, it says it's entitled Milwaukee County Asylum Cemetery. And it says the ground before you contains the mortal remains of approximately 200 souls who died at the Milwaukee County Asylum/Hospital for the Insane. These burial grounds were open from March 1880 to November 1914. Patients without financial means or family to claim them found a place of eternal peace here. Among them is Civil War veteran Albert Mems, third-class musician of the 24th Illinois Infantry. Between March 1880 and November 1914, a succession of 4 superintendents had the duty to oversee the Milwaukee County Asylum/Hospital for the Insane. Their administrations are as follows, and then 4 superintendents are listed. And the last one is a Dr. White. It says, during Dr. White's long and compassionate tenure of 27 years, many innovative programs were implemented, including proper care and burial of the unfortunate patients who died alone and without family to claim them. May they at rest find the peace and sanity they desired in life. I wanted to share that because who I really want to remember in this space today are those who have come before us who have likewise been pathologized and marginalized, criminalized, and locked away and thrown out by society. Um, Queer and trans folks around the time of this as- asylum at the time would have been pathologized and may have been there just for that reason alone. Um, and so I think it's really important to remember that these different kinds of struggles and the ways that people are thrown out um, by this society intersect. So I'm remembering them today.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing that, Britton. Um, yeah. Anything you'd like to speak on before we begin, Mason? Oh, yeah, there you go. Mason, I'm so sorry your audio isn't working for me.
Maybe if you go into your settings.
Is that any better?
Yeah.
Okay. I switched to my computer's microphone rather than my external. I was saying no, that I don't have anyone I need to bring in right now. I will bring in someone at the top of my presentation, but I'm just honored to be here and really appreciate what Britton just shared.
Thank you. All right, and the person I'd like to bring in is Sylvia Rivera, and want to honor her in all of her wholeness. And I just wanted to share a quick excerpt that I really appreciate and I think is relevant from a speech that she gave called "Bitch on Wheels." And she gave this speech at a more corporate pride gathering, and this is just a short excerpt from it. The night of the Stonewall, it happened to be the week that Judy Garland had committed suicide. Some people say that the riot started because of Judy. That's a myth. We are all involved in different struggles, including myself and many other transgender people. But in these struggles, in the civil rights movement, in the anti-war movement, In the women's movement, we were still outcasts. The only reason they tolerated the transgender community in some of these movements was because we were gung ho. We were the frontliners. We didn't take no shit from nobody. We had nothing to lose. You had all the rights. We had nothing to lose. I'll be the first one to step on any organization, any politician's toes if I have to get the rights for my community. So I wanted to bring that in, and I recommend reading the rest of that speech if you would like. It's called Bitch on Wheels by Sylvia Rivera. And yeah, let's go ahead and I'll introduce our fabulous guest today. First, we have Mason J. Mason uses he and they pronouns. They're a Blaxican indigenous historiographer, multidisciplinary artist, and cultural worker born and residing in San Francisco. They're board member at large for the GLBT Historical Society, an interim director of Radar Productions, the co-editor of Still Here San Francisco, and author of the 2022 Lambda Literary Awarded for Trans Poetry book Crossbones on My Life. And we have Britton. Britton C uses Z, them, or she, her pronouns, is a white trans femme non-binary person living in the occupied lands of the Ho-Chunk, aka Madison, Wisconsin. Z was discharged from the Wisconsin Army National Guard under the since repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in 2009, and today is a member of About Face. Since their time in the military, Britton has primarily been involved in growing and facilitating training centered on the practice of peer support in both informal and professional spaces, as well as in organized spaces. So thank you both for being here. I'm so excited and honored that you both said yes when I asked you to join. And yeah, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I believe Mason is going to kind of contextualize our discussion today with I'm so excited to see your presentation. Yeah, just gonna give some context around Pride as an anti-police riot. And yeah, I'll just let you go for it, Mason. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of uprisings pre-Stonewall and a little bit about the night of Stonewall itself, and then talk a little bit about how the hyper-militarization of the police is impacting queer people, foster youth, and unhoused people and disabled veterans as well. So I'm going to share my screen now. There we go. So let me take this back a little so we can start at the beginning. So yeah, these are the ancestors I'd actually like to call in, and they're all veterans. Some of them are living legends who are still with us. And let me see, hang on. I see you all in the chat. I'm gonna see if we can troubleshoot this right now. Does everyone see that now? Okay, great. So yeah, I'm starting this out, the top of this with 4 transgender veterans, 3 which are now our transcestors, 1 who is a living legend. And so I'm just gonna give you a little context about them to tell you about some trans folks in the military you might not know about if you don't already know these people. So up at the top here, we have Jack B. Garland. Jack was a Mexican-American son of a military man who came to San Francisco when his father was stationed out here, grew up here, and decided in his teens that he wanted to transition. So he started living life as a transgender man, using he, him pronouns. He forged a birth certificate with the help of his father's military friends and began working as a reporter. Though he wasn't physically able to fight, he actually went to cover the Philippine War, and his coverage of the war is some of the best and the most comprehensive that we've had of that war. He was unfortunately found out once he took ill while on the ship, but he was so beloved by the crew that they forced the ship to turn around in the middle of the ocean and go pick him back up. So he came back to San Francisco, reported on the war for newspapers, and basically lived a stealth life until he passed away of a heart attack in the downtown area. Next to him, we've got Miss Major Griffin Gracie, who is actually a Stonewall veteran, a military veteran, and she's still with us. She's doing activist work all over the globe to ensure that not only veterans, but queer and trans people of color are well taken care of. Here with the glamorous hat, we have a recent ancestor who's Felicia Flames, who is also a veteran and who was integral in the Compton's cafeteria riot, which I will talk about in a little bit. And she's just a glamour girl. And then on the bottom, we have Lucy Hicks Anderson, who actually didn't serve in the military, but she is a military wife. And her case against the US government is actually the basis upon which we now have access to LGBTQIA marriages. Is she was a military spouse who was receiving spousal benefits until it was found out that she wasn't born a woman, and her benefits were revoked. So she ended up suing the government and not winning, but basically setting the foundation for what we now know as gay marriage legalization. And so those are four people I always love to bring into the space to just start things off with. So the thing about these cross-dressing laws and things like that is, in order to talk about pride and police use of enforcing normative gender, we have to start all the way at the beginning. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and talk to you a little about what that all looks like. So in 1900, San Francisco created these laws, and we don't use this term anymore, but these were what they were called on the books, was they were called anti-cross-dressing laws. And they became a tool for the police and the military to enforce normative gender on masculine presenting women, feminine men, or trans or gender nonconforming people, especially disabled veterans. So you can learn about these laws through a book that I'll type in the chat so you all can check it out, or you can hit me up and I can give you a copy of it. So anyways, for decades, these laws were the norm, and they soon became a commonly adopted US practices. These laws prevented people from appearing out of uniform and living their lives in everyday dress. So if they were spotted in places that were known for serving LGBTQ people, it was really easy for their officers and for people in the military to identify when soldiers were out engaging in queer and trans life. And so they became a practice here in San Francisco, actually, which is really stark and really kind of sad for me as a local. But other people in the US and across the globe took notice of this. And so these laws started popping up all over the place. And they were mostly directed at queer and trans people, but also visibly disabled people. So if you've been disfigured in the war or as a result of some of the common plagues that were happening in the 1900s here in San Francisco, you could also be arrested for just being visibly, the word they used was ugly. You could basically be arrested for being ugly. So if you had, a mobility aid that you walked with, like a cane or a crutch, or if you had a missing limb, you could literally be picked up and arrested for being too unsightly to be seen on the streets. So due to the threats of these laws, people started taking to really unconventional means of making money. And they started appearing in what we call nowadays, I guess, like circuses or variety shows, or even in some cases at the time, what would be considered a freak show. And they were really thriving there. And so there was a really tiny period where queer people and queer veterans actually had sources of income and things they could do. But very quickly, the police took wind of that, and they started figuring out that they could use these shows to criminalize people. So instead of sending LGBT veterans and queer people to jail, they were sending them to these shows. So instead of getting arrested and incarcerated, you would be sentenced to a certain show, and you would have to do everything they told you, and either for very little pay or no pay, perform to basically have people look at you for being queer or trans or visibly disfigured. So as a result of this, a lot of people were incarcerated, and a lot of people realized that a really easy way to avoid this was to join these systems that were trying to criminalize them. So we saw a lot of LGBT people say, well, if you can't beat them, why not join rank? And so they joined the military en masse during the Second World War, which actually became the first time that the military was trying to exclude LGBT people. And so even though a bunch of soldiers had gone, fought, many of them had miraculously made it home, they were suddenly in conflict and being issued papers with H's on them, blue slips. So they weren't honorable or dishonorable discharges. They were just basically sent out into the world as civilians with no status, just an H that marked them. So the interesting thing about this is the military is what we have to thank for gay bars, is because it was no longer a thing, because their paperwork, any legal paperwork they had already identified them as LGBTQ, or in the term of the time, a homosexual. They said, well, why hide? So they started using the money that they would pool up together to open these gay bars and just say, well, let's hang out. Why hide in the shadows anymore? So they were going out in uniform, going out in civilian dress, going out however they felt, because regardless of however they were functioning in society, they still had this second class ranking despite all being veterans. So I'm going to share my screen again now to talk about how this actually created what we know as pride. So share that screen again. So this is Cooper's Donuts. This is a place that a lot of people who had been stationed in Southern California took to when they were discharged. It was a 24-hour donut shop in Los Angeles. And a lot of people had migrated up there from San Diego, a lot of naval officers on their way to San Francisco. It was kind of like the midway point. So this coffee shop is actually one of the first uprisings that we had that led to Stonewall, which is now why we have Pride. And so what happened is the first rebellions against policing of queer and trans bodies actually started in California, which people don't know. And they started, like I said earlier, as a result of all the people in the military and all the disabled people and all the LGBT people taking back their rights. So this was created to kind of say, we're not going to take it anymore. Very similar to Stonewall, the police had come in and they said, you know, show us your ID. So a very, very regimented way of relating to people. And if your ID didn't match your gender presentation, you're immediately taken in. So what happened after this was people got brave and they said, well, let's do it again. Why not continue to fight back? And that's what we saw here at California Hall. This happened on New Year's Eve in 1964. So it also does predate Stonewall a little bit. And in a bold move, they decided to hold a drag ball. They met with clergymen, they met with military personnel, they met with the San Francisco police, and they said, we're going to do this. We're following all the codes to do this, municipal codes, things like that. We're telling you, the police, that we're doing it. We have clergymen with her. And instead of accepting this, what happened was the San Francisco Police Department actually sent down cameras to snap photos of the attendees. So this is actually a photo that was taken non-consensually of people who were attending the party to arrest them at later dates. So they snapped not only the LGBT people, but the clergymen and their wives, lawyers who were not LGBT, but were there to act as litigators, to challenge the officers. They were all arrested as well. And so this is one of the biggest things that happened, because so many different groups were involved. You have the police, you have the military, you have LGBT people, you have lawyers. And this is kind of what lit the spark for these uprisings. And then we saw them all over the East Coast. We saw more in California. And we actually created a national unit here as a result of this uprising. It was unfortunately overseen by the police department. And it set a precedent for a really terse set of interactions between the police and others. So I'm going to wrap up here with a little bit about Compton's and Stonewall. Before I get into Stonewall, the thing I like to mention is that Compton's happened first, and it happened locally under very similar circumstances. So the gist of Compton's, the funny thing about Compton's is no one can agree on what date it happened. And everyone has different dates and times about when it happened, but everyone kind of agrees that it happened towards the end of August, possibly in 1966. And due to these incidents, like I said before, the I think it was called the National Transsexual Counseling Unit, the NTCU, was established, and then it was kind of up to the queer community to defend ourselves because the police were showing us that they clearly wouldn't. So the gist of Stonewall is, I'll get into this because this is really important as well, is at about 1:30 a.m., a lot of people have different timelines. That's the interesting thing about queer history is no two stories and no two experiences are the same. The police raided the Stonewall Inn. The rebellion was started, contrary to popular belief that Marsha P. Johnson threw a brick. The rebellion was actually started when a Black drag king named Storme de la Berry was mistaken for a gay man. So she was a male passing woman who was a drag queen, a drag king. And she was clubbed and she got up and she didn't know why she had been hit. So she just swung a punch and she actually ended up connecting with an officer. So she was handcuffed. They made her handcuffs too tight. And so she was starting to lose circulation in her hand and asked for her handcuffs to be loosened. They tightened them more. And then she shouted at the crowd, "Why don't y'all do something?" And that's when the melee actually began. So that's one of the things that I always like to call forth is that actually Black, queer, and trans people are the people who started the uprising, despite the media portrayal of gay white men doing things. So I'm going to close with the way to discuss kind of how police attacks on LGBTQ people and veterans are rarely legitimate concerns of public safety. Instead, they're actually really deeply rooted in homophobia, transphobia, racism, ableism, and other systems that lead to our persecution, from cutting our hair to incarceration and forced sterilization, in some cases, unlawful detainment, and in the most drastic of cases, murder. All these conditions combined with social circumstances created by the way we militarize our cities. And they lead us into not only cycles of poverty, but a lack of work or school opportunities, which result in us often enlisting in the military services at astronomically higher rates than cis people and straight people. And I only mention this because to discuss the history of Pride, we actually need to discuss the ways in which gender policing and militarization affect queer people. So for those who might not be familiar with that term, because you might be thinking police militarization, like I said, those are two separate entities. How do they interact? I'll just say that it's a spectrum defined by a combination of tactics, usually military tactics, and a culture that centers these really violent conflicts. And it involves local police departments buying really advanced weapons, attire, and mimicking tactics or rank organization structures that are developed usually through genocidal acts or really extreme war crimes. So advocates of this kind of beefing up of our police systems, they like to falsely claim that it protects officers and deters violent crime. But we've actually seen that these things target racial minorities, they target veterans, they target queer people, and they entirely eliminate civilian ability to trust law enforcement. James Baldwin has described this as an occupying force in marginalized communities. And I think that's the greatest way to think about it, is you can think of it as a military occupying force in a community, because they're basically cosplaying that they're in combat in urban areas. And research has shown that this leads to things like stopping and frisking and a war on drugs. They're literally using the term war in an urban environment. And yeah, I'll just close with the way law enforcement is existing right now. Not only does it make us feel safe, it actually compromises our physical health during a global health pandemic, and disproportionately affecting veterans who lack competent healthcare access and queer people. So right now we're seeing the police foregoing face masks at protests, using chemical weapons, which cause respiratory distress. And though Pride has become more about corporations and keeping liquor companies in business, it started out really radically, and we need to remember that. And it's also really important to remember that we literally would not have Pride, we would not have gay bars without military veterans. Um, so that's about the gist of the history. I know I probably ran a little long there, but it's one of those things is there's literally over a century to cover in about 10 to 15 minutes. So yeah, I'm gonna wrap with that and then open up for any questions. Thank you so much for letting me share this history with you and being here. I am not a veteran, but I am the son and grandson and nephew of several veterans. So it's really, really an honor for me to be here.
Thank you so much, Mason. I learned so much from you every time we have the chance to hang out to talk, and um, yeah, it's just really wonderful. You covered so much, and there's so much more to learn there. Um, I have one. You did touch on it a bit, and I just had one like follow up question. Um, just around like how have you personally seen your communities in San Francisco militarized? Yeah, can you just speak a little bit more on that? You did a bit, but I'm wondering if you.
Yeah, yeah. It's really interesting because, like I said, although I have not served, that was not because recruiters did not want me to. I started being profiled by recruiters before I was even old enough to vote, actually. And that's how I actually saw it happening. Is right around the time 9/11 happened here, the Bay Area, because the plane was actually headed towards San Francisco. The San Francisco got really nationalistic like overnight. We saw American flags everywhere. Um, I was often, even though like my bio says I'm Black, Indigenous, and Mexican, I was often mistaken for someone of Arab descent, and I started actually physically being assaulted in the street by adults when I was, I guess, 12 years old. So I was a 12-year-old child being shaken in the streets by people saying, go back to where you came from. And I'm like, I'm literally in my hometown. Where am I supposed to go? So that's how I saw it. I saw a lot of my friends. I'm a former foster youth, and the former foster youth to military service pipeline runs deep. A lot of children, as soon as they age out of the system, if they don't have a plan to go to college or a steady career, we're encouraged to join the military. They give you pamphlets on how to join the military. And so they make it sound like you have no other option. And so a lot of my friends who were queer and trans thought they had no other options. So they went back into the closet and they all joined the military. So that's how I saw it. I saw literally my friends disappear and all join the service and all change their ideologies. A lot of them become ex-gays, or a lot of them become gays living in the closet or afraid of being discharged. So that's the way I saw it. And then the last way was really about stop and frisk. Unfortunately, our current vice president decided when she was our district attorney here to enforce a lot of stop and frisk. And so it deeply impacted me and my siblings. My siblings might come from a low income family. So my mom used to dress us alike, almost in uniform. We're a military family. So we used to all have the same outfit in different colors. And that was considered gang activity. So myself at 12 or 13, my sister who was about 5, and our 3-year-old brother who was in preschool would routinely get stopped and frisked for drug activity as literal children in backpacks who just happened to be low income and all wearing the same outfit. So that's the way I saw it. It was suddenly I had a normal childhood where my family was just, all dressed alike in our dopey little matching sweatsuits. And then overnight I was being stopped. And then around high school, being recruited, literally chased. I would get chased in the streets by recruiters who wanted me to join and said that it would allow me to, get my family out of poverty and maybe connect with a family. Because I often said, I don't know my medical history because I'm adopted. That would be my get out of jail free card. And yeah, so that's how it showed up for me, literally at my door. Like the date, like 9/12/2001 is when it started here in San Francisco. And it hasn't stopped, and it's only gotten worse.
Yeah, as someone who also grew up over the bridge in Oakland, I can attest to it being very yeah, militarized overnight seemingly, as you're saying. Yeah. I want to open to Britton if you have any questions for Mason or any feedback or thoughts.
No, I trust our conversation will dive deeper, but wow, Mason, just thank you so much for sharing what you did. Like, I also thought I knew like a lot about queer and trans history and things like that, and still learned so much from you today. And also clued into some of the things where I want to dive in deeper now too. So thank you.
All right, wonderful. Yeah, I'm just seeing in the chat, like, thank you, Mason. What an amazing history to learn today. And, I want to echo that as well. And with that, I'll pass the floor to Britton, and yeah, and let you share some reflections of your time in service and whatever you want to share with us today.
Of course, yeah. So hello all. Again, I'm Britain. My pronouns are she, her, hers, or z, them, zir. Either is great. And yeah, I joined the military in 2006. So also I was impacted by propaganda um, after 9/11 as well. And I saw through a lot of it. I actually was not in favor of like the Iraq War or anything like that. Um, and yet I found myself when I was 19, after a semester in college, like turning to the military. And the reasons I turned to it are the reasons why I think so many people who come from marginalized or oppressed backgrounds or who are queer or trans end up joining the military, was related for me around housing and financial security and still having access to college and things like that. And so, of course, the recruiters who were after me at the time had all these great promises of, I would basically be able to continue my life as it was, keep on going to college, have stable housing, all these benefits, right? Sign on bonuses if I pick the right job in the military. Um, and I went for it. I went for it, I think, because I thought I was a little deluded at the time, that I could do some good in some of the most harmful places, right? Um, and I rationalized a lot to myself at the time too of like what I did. I joined as infantry. I joined as infantry largely for the sign-on bonus. But I also thought like, no, I can do good in this. Like I can be one of the good ones, like even if I deploy, right? And then I join and I realized just even right away in training, how all of the training is set up to completely strip you of all of your old values, or ways of viewing or seeing the world into one that is, in my case, Army approved. We're given our new values, right? They sound great. Things like selfless service or personal courage or integrity, all those sound great. However, these values are interpreted through the military's lens. And so, what integrity means in that context is probably not what integrity actually means when you're thinking about your personal values or personal courage or how that might show up within you is what I found. Um, and so one of the things that happened for me was after going through infantry training and reporting back to my unit, because I was National Guard, was I was told that my unit had been disbanded and reorganized, and the combat military occupational specialties, or MOSs as they're called, um, were all used up. And so I needed to pick a new job in the military, basically. So I ended up picking a paralegal specialist and got assigned to a unit that was overseeing a deployment of Wisconsin Army National Guard soldiers in 2007 to Iraq. And in that process, I process wills and powers of attorney, things like that, for deploying soldiers, and then witnessed a lot of the things that led to my moral injury in my time in the military. I saw how much the Army would fight for people with domestic violence charges, um, other things like OWIs, things like that, to just get those things out of the way and dealt with, not for the purpose of like bettering their lives or getting people like treatment or services or support, but just so that they could legally hold a rifle and deploy once again, right? And these were people who had already been like dealing with this was going to be in some cases their fourth deployment as a National Guard soldier in 3 years' time almost. Um, and it's no wonder. that a lot of the people we were processing were going through some of the struggles, and their families were going some of the struggles they were going through. Not to mention the impact of invasion and imperialism and military occupation throughout the world, right? But these were my experiences I witnessed and participated in just in processing soldiers at the time. So I ended up looking at my options. I knew I couldn't go forward doing what I was doing, and I ended up coming out under Don't Ask, Don't Tell at the time, knowing that that would initiate the process of my discharge. And that time, I ended up joining what was at the time entitled called Iraq Veterans Against the War. Now is about face veterans against the war. But that was a bit of my military history um, and experience. It wasn't until later when I started learning more about the impacts of militarism and imperialism throughout the world. Um, but my journey began in realizing that my own thoughts of what I could do to do good in the military were pretty futile in a system that was much, much larger than me. And that if I wanted to actually hold myself with integrity or personal courage, I had to actually go against the values or goals or agendas that were those of the military at the time. So.
Thank you for sharing a bit of yourself and your story. I'm wondering if you can share, like, from your perspective, uh, why representation, specifically in the military. But I think that we can kind of make it even a broader context. Why representation within these systems doesn't equal liberation or doesn't get us any closer to liberation.
Totally. Yeah, thank you. I think so I think about many of the reasons why queer and trans folks join the military in the first place. And I see things like housing as a major concern, or just financial precarity in general, access to healthcare, um, a sense of belonging, or in some cases, like family ties or family connections. A lot of queer and trans people are not accepted as who they are um, by their families, and many families have history of military service, and that can be part of belonging, while also getting some just basic needs met that aren't provided in our capitalist society. Um, and so when I think about those driving forces that like drove me into the military, but I have also seen drive many others into the military, I'm thinking like still in that we should not have one option to get those things met. And also, I have rarely, on the other side now, and now that I'm out of the military, come across other queer and trans military veterans and heard stories where all those promises panned out into truths, um, where like the benefits came about. It's really, really easy to be given a dishonorable discharge, or just even if it's still like an honorable category, general discharge, where like you still won't get a lot of those benefits that were promised to you. And like, when I was discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, um, Army came back after me for a lot of money, right? So I was worse off in many ways for joining the military. Um, and I think is that's not what we hear about when we hear about trans and queer inclusion in the military. Um, this also isn't like for those who I am in community with, the top issue in our lives, right? The top issues in our lives are like equitable access to like qualified or competent or just not horrible mental health or substance use support. Uh, Not going into a hospital and being re-traumatized yet again, knowing that you're going to have accessible housing Like, and I mean accessible too, because a lot of the trans and queer people I'm in community with are also in disability communities. Um, and so I'm like, and yet, more like largely, and what gets a narrative in media context is this queer and trans inclusion in military or other settings like police systems as well, um, where it's like, oh, we need to get queer and trans people in those spaces, and then we'll affect change. Then things will be equitable or better for everyone. But that's actually not panning out into reality. And why don't we address the issues where people are actually being harmed right now, also in incarcerated systems, right? So I guess I could go on, but I'll just kind of end there.
Yeah, thank you. So, like, if you actually met the needs of our communities, maybe we wouldn't have to join the one option that provides those for us. Um,
Or pretends to provide them.
yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Us should be providing them for us. Yeah. Okay. I also wanted to ask you about this is a question I think about often when I reflect on my experience in the Marine Corps. And it's around like the military has a very binary, kind of old fashioned, conservative, um, narrow definition of gender. And I was wondering if you could speak about this and the contradictions that come up with those like very narrow definitions of gender, and maybe share a bit if you feel comfortable with it, a bit about your experience of gender within the military.
Of course. Really quickly too, I want to go back to the last question. Just like, why is it not liberation, right? Why is this inclusion not liberation? Like, it's also like, what are the impacts of those systems that you're joining? And if we understand that our liberation is linked, and our liberation is also not just that on Turtle Island, but that of all oppressed peoples throughout the world, like the military is not the way. Policing systems are not the way. Like they are specifically designed to protect uh, capital, profits, private property, um, and resource exploitation that ultimately makes people's lives much worse, not to mention just the real effects of death and destruction that comes from war and militarization throughout the world. Um, and so I didn't want to leave that topic without also like really grounding in that. Um, but yeah, on gender, like I would be so curious to I'll share, but I'm really curious to hear Mason your ideas of this too, as someone who was not in the military, but like has military connection and family, and also like was hounded by recruiters. But I guess for me, it's like it's interesting because when I came out as don't ask, don't tell, I came out as bisexual, and like though that's true, I was also trans, but I didn't have full awareness of that at the time. While I was in the military, I was still presenting in the world as male, uh, perceived of myself, at least like in my own like understanding or language at the time as male. Um, but it's interesting. I was actually interviewed by the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel um, when I was going through that discharge process, and I read that article a while ago, and I realized like a lot of the language I was using to talk about my experience as at that time a bisexual, I use that word, person in the military was actually language centered in gender. I talked about that it was like a faux masculinity that I was held to in the military, right? And it was specifically a masculinity that was based on aggression and violence and beefing yourself up, making yourself intimidating, finding revelry and excitement in depictions or scenes or experiences of destruction or literal loss of limbs. I'm remembering some of like the chants that we had during infantry training, which was like just loving the sight of blown up bodies. And it's like that's what happens in that. And it is connected to the sense of how you're expected to hold yourself in a gendered way in the military. And that applies both to l- well, to people of all genders in the military, honestly. Like when I think of those chants and how the training is done, um, that like we all go through that. And when we think of all the ways we express our gender in the world, there's actually like, is it really queer and trans inclusion? Is it inclusion of the full range of gendered embodiment in the world? Or is it only this one specific way of social expressions of gender, right? Um, those that are considered acceptable or normalized or supportive of a greater militaristic society. Um, and so, in that sense, like I found uh, my gendered experience in the military to be extremely confining. Um, and I knew that I was more free outside of the military than within. So, yeah, that's just my experience. But yeah, I'm curious, Mason, if you have any reflections on that question.
I do actually, because interestingly enough, my aunt, who is 100%, she was 100% cis and straight, was often subjected to weird, almost eugenics-based ideas of what womanhood was because she was naturally 6'2". So she served on the USS Kirk in the 70s and was often assumed to be gay, just literally based on her size. And so this idea of the what a female in the Navy should look like, she superseded it and was taller than, some of the men on the ship with her. And so she was automatically assumed undateable and undesirable, even though you're not really supposed to do that. People do. So she said she maintained like a single life for most of like her time in the service, although everyone else was able to date normally because she was standing ahead over people. Like, and so that was for me. It was just like, what? Like you are? Like, she's a total man eater. like she should have been having the time of her life, but because she was 6'2", everyone was like, oh no, too masculine, too this, too that, and so just these really rigid ideas. And a lot of my friends who served, and then me, I always thought it was strange that recruiters were trying to pick up me because I've been visibly queer in every gender expression or presentation I've had. So it's like they knew this. They knew that I would be queer when they were even seeing me. That's probably the reason they were trying to pick me up. So that's what it is for me. Is it's always been really interesting. And like I said, that book Arresting Dress by Claire Sears talks about how even a lot of the ideas of what gender should look like come from minstrel shows. So almost these like hyper exaggerated racialized forms of defining what manness is, defining what womanhood is, based on this really militaristic Eurocentric idea. So even for me as a civilian outside, like literally walking out of my house, the ways in which I'm perceived are influenced by the government, the police, or the military. Just the way we even look at gender and how we define it. Gender was actually not even defined as male and female exclusively until eugenics in the 40s when Nazis were deciding to decide what gender was what. So that's, for me, one of the interesting things is like, my grandma is older than the gender binary. That we have people who are living amongst us who are older than the idea of there only being two biological sexes. So.
Yeah, Mason, one of the things you shared before that really stuck out to me was the experience of like how you were experiencing recruiters and also friends. How you talked about your friends almost feeling like your community was being disappeared, right? Um, and that is also connected to gender. It's like it is true that like there are requirements around like how you dress, how you present when you join the military. And, like some of that's understandable in certain contexts, but like also this is where you're going full time, right? So it is very much a way of policing gender as well. Um just by the regulations around gender presentation that exist in military structures. Um, and so it's like, I think back to that liberation idea. What is pride? What is celebration of our gendered and sexual embodiments in the world? And it is not constriction and a method of confinement where you are also part of a system that's perpetuating harms and ecological catastrophe upon our world.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm like, I've gotten into this saying of like, I'm beyond asking for acceptance. Like, I'm here for your celebration of who I am, like fully. Acceptance was like yesterday. I needed that. Now I need your celebration of who I am. That kind of leads us wonderfully into the next question I had for both of you, if you feel like answering, which is like, what would a world without militarism mean for you personally, for your communities, and what would that look like? Yeah, and, Mason or Britton, whoever wants to go for it first.
I think that's such a like I was like I can spend 5 hours defining what my utopia without militarization would look like. I think it would be freedom to remember who we are and where we came from. I think that would for sure be it for me. Is the militarization is all about regimenting how we behave and what we do and micromanaging those things. So I feel if people had more, even people who aren't queer and trans, if they had more room to explore with their gender, that people who are willingly doing that would have an easier go of it because people would learn that a lot of the things we're taught about how we're supposed to present or what's what are BS anyway. So I think that's what it would look like for me. I imagine a world in which, you know, civilians don't end up with PTSD from the cops, you know? That's my experience. Is I didn't serve in the military, but as a result of the militarization of San Francisco, I was queer profiled by the SFPD in 2011. And so now I live with PTSD, even though I'm not a veteran, but as a result of militarization. So it would look like a world where that wouldn't happen, that people who are just outside, standing outside with their partners, wouldn't be profiled by the police, or that we wouldn't automatically be deemed suspicious. So that would be it. There would be less queer people in the prison industrial complex, less people forced to endure things that we don't need to. I think that's what it would look like. It'd be a beautiful world. People could just figure out how they needed to embody their gender and relate to each other in those ways rather than mimicking these really harmful systems that we've just been relying on because they're what we've been doing. I think that's the funniest thing. We don't have to keep doing them. We could just stop. So that's what it would look like. Just stop. That would be the world without militarization. How about you not?
Oh, all that. um, I I also think so before coming on to share in this conversation today with you all, I also did listen in to the Demilitarize You on queer and trans inclusion in the military. And I really liked a point that was centered there by, was it Dean? Um, Dean, yeah. And it was kind of this frustration of, when there are huge campaigns to focus on these uh, pieces of supposed liberation that really get centered by capitalist political parties or, the nonprofit industrial complex. Um, when there are ways we can actively support each other right now. Um, and I think like I'm all here for envisioning like a world beyond like what we have, and also what can we build within the cracks of empire currently too, is something I want us to own and explore. And it's like there is a lot of peer support and mutual aid that I see happening in my communities, and I think we can focus our efforts more on those places more effectively and support people in the here and now who are dealing with housing insecurity or lack of safe or accessible services within healthcare settings or other settings, or helping queer trans people who are getting out of incarcerated settings. Um, I think that is part of our liberation that we can engage in right now, because it is part of propaganda, this idea that we can't, or that we have to give that over to existing systems or structures or organizations, right? But there is a lot we can do if we have an extra bed or an extra couch or a healthier paycheck from time to time too. But beyond that, um, I think it would also be a world without police, right? We wouldn't need structures that um, commit harm um, in order to get our basic needs met. Structures that restrict people's movement or where they can work or how they can work in order to get their basic needs met. So I think that's the world we can move towards, right? And there are lots of envisioned pathways forward, but I think also how we get there is seeing how these different struggles are interrelated and how we can show up for each other, personally right now in reproductive justice and bodily autonomy struggles, um, in abolitionist struggles, etc.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, my last question and for y'all is, and Mason started touching on it, so I hope you can maybe fill it out a little bit. Is like, why should cis and queer folks be concerned? Why should they be concerned with queer liberation? Why should they be concerned um, with this PR move to include queer and trans people, include in quotes, queer and trans people in the military and in these militarized systems? Um, yeah, why should they include that and be concerned with that within their analysis of US empire?
I think it's really crucial to remember that when we analyze the US empire, that these things are just intertwined in a way that can't be undone. So the reason that everyone needs to care and it's not like a community specific issue is it actually impacts everyone. The easiest way I like to break it down is things that don't necessarily even impact the LGBT community at the face value actually do. One of the interesting things that I think is actually a tool of the military industrial complex, and this is a really controversial take, but it is mine, is that I think reproductive rights issues are actually really intertwined with the prison industrial complex and the military complex, because you automatically have people who are under resourced if they're forced to have children they don't want to have. Those children sometimes, but not always, grow up to have, needs or desires that go beyond what their families can provide for them. And so they seek out either petty crime or things like that, or gang activity, which then leads them into prison or into joining the military by force and things like that. So just by even controlling birthing people's bodies, you then create a whole new class of soldiers and people who can do your bidding for you. So it goes back, it's that insidious, literally conception. That's how far you can trace it back. And so whether you're queer or not, everyone has to come from somewhere. We're not getting dropped off by a stork. So that's really what it is. It's just on a baseline level, like reproductive health. If there's children being born, those are automatically future soldiers. So you can't, that's the way the government sees it. Future bodies to put in prison and make money off of, future bodies to send and do our bidding. And so that's why you should care, because it impacts you. It impacts your tax dollars that go to treating and dealing with the consequences of war and the people who come back with their morals and their values shaken and have to reintegrate into society and are not given the support to do so. So it's an experience that's shared, whether you're queer and trans or not, whether you're civilian or an actual veteran. This is something that impacts you because it impacts the way our country and the world operates.
one of our chats was Mason is on fire, and you're absolutely right. Like seriously, and oh my gosh, I'm so glad you named that. I was thinking about that so much over this past weekend of just like the impacts of when you say no, you have to have this baby, and when yeah, exactly what you said about what that will lead to in 18 years' time. And like that's not overinflated or like just a hypothetical. It's like I've been lucky. I'm in between jobs right now, and I've had a lot of time on my hands. And part of the things I've been doing is reading up more on different historical time periods. And like I was reading up on like the late 1800s, and you know, like these things were intentional. Like a lot of this was very intentional, and we may feel like it's like a comment like that is a little like taking it off the deep edge or overinflated, but like it's literally not. Like this was a plan, and it's happening, and it's continuing, and it's probably no wonder when we're in a time where people are seeing through the lies of capitalism, seeing through, uh, or like seeing more clearly the ecological harm that we've had on the world and the impacts of climate change and what's going forward, where these systems understand we're going to actually have to force people to have kids now. So, um, but yeah, why should cis um, or straight people care? I think yes, because it is all linked. Like when we talk about queer and trans issues, we are talking about housing issues. We're talking about equitable healthcare. We're talking about systems that are less traumatizing. We're talking about um, the fact that a lot of people are still just one paycheck away from utter like financial ruin or destruction and not knowing where you or your family are going to live. Um, and a lot of queer and trans people are involved in these struggles and feel them very concretely right now. And it is worth learning from one another because it only takes one different variable until we're all in that same situation. Honestly, we're already all there together now. It's just we're not all seeing it all the time. So that's what I'm thinking there. So I think I say that also informed by my trans experience because like I came into I'm a trans femme, and so I inhabited the world as a white man for a long time and had a lot of things made for me. Um, and then having that experience of even shifting one of those variables, right? And how the world can be different. I've had the same issue now as someone experiencing chronic pain or disabilities, right? Um, we are all in the system where we have to learn from each other in our struggles because they are connected.
Yeah, yeah. Yes to everything everyone shared, and I venture to say in this space maybe that's not a controversial hot take, Mason. But yeah, we can all learn from one another, like you're saying, Britain. And all right. So I mean, I could talk to y'all all day and tomorrow, um, but I value your time. And yeah, let's just open it up for closing thoughts. Britain first, and then Mason. Um, and well, before I just want to say just a deep, heartfelt thank you, and I so look forward to the next time I see you, IRL Mason, and you know, in all various ways, Britain, on various platforms and whatnot, and learning from you both again. Um, so yeah, we'll open it up for closing thoughts from Britain, and then closing thoughts from Mason. And if you feel called to, Mason, I would love to hear a poem of yours. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just so grateful to be able to be here in this space with you all today, and all of those watching too. Because honestly, this feels the most Pride Month to me that I felt all month, to tell you the truth. Because for me, talking about how we are affected by empire, and by these systems, talking about pathways of resistance and why, that fires me up. That causes me to feel pride because I see even when um, queer and trans communities are going through immense struggle, we find these ways to come together. And also that history is part of that too. Like without the history, like, I don't know, like, thank you, Mason, for inspiring me to dive deeper into all of that. Because I think it is central to understanding our current day situations and where we can lean on, even from those who aren't physically here with us anymore. Um, so yeah, I'm thinking a lot about that.
I'm similarly thinking about the ways in which that oftentimes the history specifically of veterans, because like I said, we have a Stonewall literal veteran, a Compton's cafeteria veteran, someone who served in the Philippine War, all trans. I think that's really interesting to me, is that I was like, I had no idea that these people are responsible for these things. So these are people who felt the sting of what it was like to come back to society already being outcast, whether they were closeted or out in the service. Things like that always spring to mind. People like Jose Saria, who was a veteran, who slept his way into the service, which a lot of people don't know, is he was actually too short to even enlist, and he slept with his recruiter. And so that's how he got into the military and came out and, couldn't get a job because he was visibly queer and said, okay, I guess I'll try being a politician. And so he almost successfully ran. And the only reason he didn't win was that homophobes all registered as candidates. And so it stratified the vote because he was likely going to win the election and become the first gay supervisor. And this was years before Harvey Milk. So it's interesting things like that. People who just go for things is a way that I love to kind of think about that. So yeah, I think I'm cut off. I'm trying to see what's happening here. Can you folks still hear me? I'm seeing on my end that I'm having Wi-Fi trouble. Okay,
Yeah.
you can still hear me.
Yeah.
All right. So then I guess I'll go into a poem in that case. I think a lot about the militarization of urban cities growing up in the Fillmore, which used to be the Harlem of the West Coast in the 40s and the 50s. And so this is a poem that's from my book, and it's called Helicopters in Neighborhoods. And it's about the prevalence of in my neighborhood during the late 80s and the early 90s of overhead choppers and how that created a real sense of strangeness. It's actually the back illustration on my book. It's a vulture wearing a police hat. So yeah, this is Helicopters in Hoods. Circling carry-on corpses in California food deserts, flying low and slow in San Francisco, hopping fare gates and ghost riding across bridges from Marin City, Fruitvale, Antioch, Richmond, Fairfield. Oh, hood vulture, I know your predatory flight all too well, from my early bird brain memories of eating dinner on the floor in silence, doing homework in a bathtub while you zigzag overhead, as I try my best to avoid the snap, crackle, popping off of shots going off in the street. A migratory drive-by flight my fright took subconsciously. I've been desensitized but traumatized in this destination I was born knowing how to arrive at, being another black or brown bird shot for sport. Filthy urban fowl trilling short-circuited tin can walkie-talkie chirps, shrieking cockatiel songs from the sky as you shit shells onto cars. This is a swan song for my first exposure to CPTSD, aka the ghetto bird flu, a twittering to say, I'm sick of you, never more knowing whether to play dead or be a dead bird at the bottom of the military industrial cage. All right. Thank you so much for sharing this time and this space with me and allowing me to share my work. Yeah, my book's available online It's called Crossbones on My Life. So if you want to hear more poems about that and the ways in which the world wrongs queer and trans people and queer history, it's all in here. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on. It was an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to share this time and space with you all. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Powerful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mason. Thank you, Britton.
Thank you all.
Goodbye to all.